This podcast is brought to you through support from our partner, the Calliopeia Foundation. The Calliopeia Foundation envisions a future grounded in compassion, respect, dignity, reverence for nature, and care for each other in the earth. To learn more, visit calliopeia.org.
Welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young.
Unfortunately, we as a whole need to have our wallets tell us not to waste, because every other cultural cue we're getting is to consume.
Today we are speaking with Camila Thorndike. Camila, a lifelong climate campaigner, was born and raised in rural Southern Oregon and lives in Washington, D.C. Most recently, she worked with the Chesapeake Climate Action Network to lead a campaign uniting 100 organizations and businesses to pass fair and effective local climate policy. After graduating from Whitman College, Camila worked for the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution, led outreach for an Arizonian urban planning campaign, and spearheaded engagement for Fire Rock, a musical theater project on fossil fuels. In 2009, she worked with DC youth on energy efficiency in low-income households with the mayor's Green Summer Jobs program. She later co-founded Our Climate, a grassroots national nonprofit that empowers the next generation of climate leaders to pass strong, fair carbon pricing laws. Camila is a fellow for the Center of Diversity and the Environment, Sitka Fellow, Udall Scholar, Mike 50 awardee, member of the Young Climate Leaders Network, a Grist 50 fixer, and recipient of the 2018 DC Environmental Network Award. So for the vast majority of us living in this country, life as we know it is absolutely dependent upon and revolves around the fossil fuel industry. And this in turn has made polluters really out of all of us. However, the fossil fuel industry has not only benefited off our dependence, but they've also gotten off scot-free when it comes to the incredible cost of climate change. Industry has yet to be held responsible for the crimes they are committing against us and our only place of belonging. We need change, and we need it now. And we must examine the true cost of fossil fuels and climate change, especially during a time when it has been predicted that carbon emissions are expected to increase by 2.7% in 2018. So thank you so much, Camila, for joining me today to discuss how putting a price on carbon and other greenhouse gases is actually a necessary step in achieving some semblance of climate stability.
Such an honor. Thank you for having me.
So before we begin discussing the particulars of carbon pricing, I'd really like to discuss who will bear the cost of climate change and who has already borne the cost of the fossil fuel industry. And I know while there's some obvious overlap, I think it's important to distinguish the socialized costs that we're paying for today and then the costs future generations are set to pay. So perhaps you could begin by discussing who has suffered historically from the negative externalities of the fossil fuel industry.
Absolutely. I think the answer is something that more and more of our sort of mainstream society is becoming aware and that is that the populations and communities that have always had the least and been treated the worst are those who've borne the brunt of the fossil fuel industry's impacts. And historically, that's primarily been from point source pollution in the form of an environmental injustice, from whether it be fracking sites or oil fields or coal mines, the communities that bear the pollution that is directly emanating from those sites, whether it's soot or mercury or contaminated water sources and everything that follows, whether it's hotspot concentrations of cancer and other diseases or stunted growth, work abilities, whatever it is, that's really been here since, the beginning of industry. And what we're seeing now is that more globalized effects that are further apart in cause and effect, or kind of the time of the pollution and the place of that pollution, and then the ripples out through our ecosystem and our climate systems. That's what climate change has done, is sort of extend those impacts of the fossil fuel industry across time and space. And yet it's still those communities who've had the least and been treated the worst that are bearing the brunt. And what we see in the United States is similar to what we see worldwide. Those are, young people, those are the elderly, those are people of color, that's women, and the poor.
I think it's really important that we begin to understand the disproportionate effects that people are suffering. So thank you for going into that a bit. And I think about that due to these tremendous social costs generated by fossil fuels, many have called for and I might mispronounce this, but a Pigovian tax, which is a tax on any market activity that creates negative externalities in order to correct an undesirable market outcome, like high taxes on cigarettes or taxing plastic bags, for example. So I'd like to talk to you about carbon taxes and carbon pricing by breaking it down one by one, because there are just so many moving parts, which to its detriment, I think causes some to shy away from the subject. But ultimately, your argument is that the best way to fight climate change is to make carbon pollution expensive by making carbon a part of the market. So maybe you could begin by explaining the two mechanisms of pricing carbon and which one you advocate for.
Absolutely. So yes, Pigovian taxation is named after an English economist in the early 20th century, Arthur Pigou, who advocated for, kind of really showed the world how the tax code can be used to address societal ills. And we've seen how imposing taxes, sometimes called sin taxes, on what we as a society decide we want less of, can really work. And cigarette taxes are a prime example of that above all of the advertising and public education and awareness work that nicotine's addictive and cigarettes cause cancer when smoked, it was really the imposition of the cigarette taxes, and especially in the case of young people, where we saw their use decline in popularity. And so there's a really direct relationship between what we buy, consume, and use, and the price for those products and services, which is intuitive, I think, to all of us. We know that when there's, two products on the grocery shelf and they look more or less the same, we're going to go with the one that's cheaper. We're all looking out for kind of our bottom lines and trying to save money, which is time and resources to direct to the things that matter most in our life. And so the idea of taxing carbon has been around for decades. As soon as it was clear that we had a unfolding climate crisis driven by the overuse of fossil fuels, economists and policy experts started thinking about how the tax code could again be put to use, given the ubiquity of the product and our ubiquitous dependence upon it. Like you pointed out in the beginning of the episode, there's so many different interactions with fossil fuels every day, many of which are completely invisible except for that point of sale, except for when we pay the bill for gas or electricity or the gasoline at the pump. Those are obvious points at which the price of fossil fuels is right there in an obvious way, but it's invisible in the ways that it shows up in back to the grocery bill or our clothes or the actual car or even bicycle that we buy or paper or vacations, whatever it is. I mean, we're using fossil fuels for energy to power all these different elements of our life. And that's why we have to think about the price kind of secret that we can unlock that would allow for the dirty fuel that might be replaced by a clean one to show up so we can make those choices, especially when it's not an obvious matter of just switching our utilities. We need that price signal, as it's called, to be sent throughout the economy, throughout all the goods and services that I just mentioned and all the ones that you might be thinking of, so that two things happen. One, we have the incentive to look elsewhere. If the price of fossil fuels and all the things that are made with fossil fuels go up, then we as consumers will start looking for alternatives that are cheaper. And we as investors and business people and entrepreneurs will start producing those alternatives. The most obvious example is in the form of electricity. Why burn electricity or use electricity that's generated from burning coal when we can use electricity that's generated from the sun? Well, in many cases, it's been because that conventional electricity is cheaper. If the renewable electricity becomes less expensive than the fossil fuel-based electricity, then we all shift over. Consumers shift over, and investors and entrepreneurs and business people to provide the solar electricity that we might use. So that's one benefit of putting a price on carbon, is that it really allows all of us who are buying and selling and goods and services to participate in that transition together and have the incentives aligned so that it works out. The second reason, and then I'll get into the mechanisms by which we can do this, is that we need to conserve energy. It's really not just a matter of replacing the energy that we use from fossil fuels now with renewables, because we, for instance, as Americans, consume at least 4 planets worth of resources if the whole world were to live like we do on average. So we know that we're consuming at this insanely unsustainable rate. And a large part of that is because we're wasting energy like nobody's business. I mean, think about the combustion engine of a regular gas-powered car. I mean, it loses incredible amounts of energy in the form of heat. Well, why are we burning a fuel that generates, not only the power to move the wheels, but all of this excess heat that just goes nowhere? We're not using it. There are other kinds of engines, other kinds of ways of getting around that we can use that are more efficient. But we need to have reasons to become more efficient. As long as that gas is cheap, the companies that sell it are going to keep us hooked to it. And so we need reasons to conserve, and we know that whether it's turning off the lights or choosing to vacation closer to home or buy local produce or what have you, if you have to pay more than you're comfortable with, then you're not going to do it. And that's a really powerful driver of energy efficiency. So the ways that we can price carbon are most directly are through 2 policies. The first that you might have heard of is cap and trade, and the other is a carbon tax. So cap and trade is when the government sets the cap or the limit on the amount of pollution that we want to allow as a society, and as we know, that needs to eventually reduce over time to zero. In fact, by 2045. 2050, it needs to reduce to zero. So the government sets that cap and reduces that cap over time. And then the market, per se, sort of responds by setting the price of that pollution. And the way this works is that the government holds auctions for the sale of permits to pollute the amount of total pollution that's allowed under that cap. And over time, as the cap reduces, the number of permits also reduces. And what we know from basic supply and demand in Econ 101 and from the experience that all of us have in our lives is that when something becomes more scarce, it becomes more valuable. So the permits become more expensive over time as that cap declines over time. The carbon tax works. It results in the same outcome of pollution now having a price and being something that we want to avoid, but it does it with the inverse sort of relationship between the government and the market. The government, instead of setting the limit on pollution as it does with cap and trade, it sets the price of pollution. So the government sets the price per ton of carbon or carbon dioxide equivalents that's allowed, or rather that we're emitting, that we're producing. And then as that price goes up over time, then the society responds by limiting our pollution. So that the price is known, the amount of pollution is not known, but what we know is that as the price goes up, we'll pollute less. And there's a lot more that I can get into on those, but that's the basic.
Well, it just is this reminder that so much comes down to money, if not almost everything, because we still very much are entrenched in this capitalist system. And as much as I wish that we didn't have to put a price tag on the air, on water, it seems like in many ways we do. We actually need to be able to put numbers on things like pollution, putting these cap and trades. And, I have a lot of mixed feelings about it that we can get more into as the interview goes. But when we're still, like I said, entrenched in this capitalist system, it's kind of like using the, using the tools that are already there to try to change it from the inside out. And so I do see a lot of benefit, and it's really interesting to learn about the intricacies of it. So I really do want to hear more. And I'm also hearing Tom Goldtooth's interview in my mind, who's so against cap and trade and so against programs like RED, because he feels that it's just a way to commodify the air. And it also affects indigenous peoples in South America because, for instance, RED, this program, can kick indigenous peoples off their land in order to protect these forests for carbon sequestration, or as a way to sequester the carbon that companies can pay for these forests so that they can trade it with their pollution. So I know that it can get kind of messy. And so I guess this question I'm conjuring is, what are the pitfalls of carbon trading or cap and trade, especially given that Interpol has stated that the $176 billion carbon market has become rife with organized crime. So how has the cap and trade system fared for the many, say, East Coast states who have had cap and trade system in place since 2009?
Great points. So the first thing I want to say, and very clearly, is that carbon pricing is a term that encompasses a multitude of policy specifics. The two main options I already outlined, there's cap and trade, there's carbon taxes. But within even those two ideas, there are so many ways that you can go about this. And the devil really is in the details, because each policy arrangement will reflect a different set of values. And the same power and force of the fossil fuel industry that could turn an alternate policy approach into something very bad exists for carbon pricing. No policy solution is immune to the power of the fossil fuel and other industries to corrupt its purpose and turn it into something that we don't support. And I think right now, or recently, there's been a lot of critique of carbon pricing that's not including the whole universe of potential climate policies and the ways that those two can be corrupted, and those two have been put into effect with maybe not the kind of outcomes that they were intended for. So with that said, Tom Goldtooth and the Indigenous Environmental Networks, I think important work to point out where cap and trade in particular can go wrong, that many of those critiques are 100% spot on, and I think really merit debate. So one element that they're zeroing in on is the offsets that can be included in cap and trade policies. And I say can be because they're not an inherent part of a cap and trade policy. They are an option that can be added on to defray the costs of transitioning away from dirty energy, primarily for the industries that lobby the loudest not to bear those costs. So this is just like pure political economy, that if those industries weren't so effective, then things like offsets wouldn't probably be on the table. And offsets alone themselves aren't even a terrible idea. It's the kinds of offsets that are being proposed. And this is where it can get very complicated. But I think one rule of thumb to consider is that the closer to home, to where that policy is being enacted, that an offset is being valued, is the work that is actually taking place to reduce emissions, that then is sold for a company that might not reduce emissions in its own operations, but instead purchases that offset for credit to meet its obligations under the cap on pollution. That's how an offset works. The closer to home that actual change is happening, the better. And so the red markets, the forest, kind of global carbon credits from forests in the world, sometimes those are very, very far from home. And it's not to say that the closer the better all the time, but the more complexity you introduce in time and distance, the more loopholes and the less scrutiny there is. And so it's true that some of these programs to pay indigenous peoples to, not live in their homeland and not, use the forest and inhabit the forest in the way that they have gone terribly wrong, and might be a model that we just shouldn't contemplate. But there are other examples within our own country where offsets have been very productive and very helpful, where there are private forest owners or farmers or entrepreneurs who are receiving an income doing the right thing when they otherwise wouldn't have any revenue to support that activity and would therefore not be able to do it. So, for instance, there's private forests in the Northeast, I believe in Vermont even, that is being supported by the Californian cap and trade program. And that's allowing forests to remain standing instead of cut down. That is something that I think that we would all support. So that's, again, the devil's in the details. Like, what are we talking about when we critique carbon pricing? What are we talking about when we critique offsets? It's also true that political force that puts offsets in place, and especially those that are more difficult to verify, more controversial, incorporate, human rights abuses, that will exist for any policy, and it could exist for a carbon tax in the form of exemptions. It's just actors not wanting to pay for pollution, not wanting to transition, that are looking for a way out. So I want that to be very clear, that the critiques against carbon pricing are not critiquing the overall idea. And to your larger point, is it right to basically commodify the earth? That's actually not how I see carbon pricing at all. I see it as a basic tool of justice, because it's just wrong for private industry to use our public skies as a dumping ground. And it's just wrong for private industry to reap untold profits. I mean, fossil fuel industry is the most wealthy industry that has ever existed in human history. And it's wrong that they get to just be as greedy as they want to be at the cost of our lives and our futures. The fact is that a price is going to be paid. But right now, we're the ones paying it. We're the ones who are paying for their bad behavior. And that basic tenet of justice is that the person responsible for causing harm should be the one who bears the cost, who bears the consequences. And carbon pricing, more than any other policy tool, most directly forces the companies causing climate change to bear the costs instead of us. And it's not to say that there aren't other ways to shut them down and to transition to other ways of living and using power, but carbon pricing is the only policy tool that generates revenue, that takes the money from the fossil fuel industry by taxing them or requiring that they pay permits to pollute. And then that's a pool of public funds. It's like we're reclaiming the value that belongs to us all. We're making it public again. We're reclaiming the commons, I would say. And that pool of funds that is managed by the government, which if we can defend our democracy, is in turn managed by all of us, returns to all of us. And the kind of carbon pricing that I most love and think holds the greatest potential to really serve the justice that is due is a carbon fee and rebate or carbon tax and dividend policy, where the funds raised from making polluters pay are divvied up in equal amounts and sent back to every individual that lives in the state or the country that policy is being enacted in. And that makes for extraordinarily progressive distributional economics. So the people who are paying the most in their health and their livelihoods and their actual dollars are benefited the most proportionally. It gives everybody a ticket, kind of a golden ticket into this transformed economy. It doesn't just let some people get the benefits and others, left out in the dark. And psychologically and kind of morally, I think that holds tremendous importance. And it makes sure that everybody has the means to then transition their lives over to clean energy and energy efficient modes that initially, before they become the status quo options, can be a little bit more expensive. So it gives everybody cash to do that.
The For the Wild podcast team is so grateful for the continued support through our Patreon subscribers. If you haven't signed up yet, head over to www.patreon.com/forthewild to engage directly with our team, weekly guests, to hear additional content, and receive access to other bonus material throughout the year.
The fact is, polluters are still polluting. We're still using the fossil fuels. The majority of us listening to this podcast are directly entrenched in the fossil fuel economy, even if we don't work for fossil fuel industry. Whether we have cars, we heat our home, we cook, we have a phone, we have a computer, all of these things, they add up to some type of pollution, resource extraction. And so part of me says, you know what? This is the system that we're in right now. We need to use the tools. We need to Robin Hood as much money as we can from the fossil fuel industries and distribute it. And of course, then the other side of me goes, oh my gosh, like this could be, whether it's the money that's these dividends could be, the cream could be taken from the top and used in ways we don't see fit, like taxes in general. I mean, how many times do you or your friends or somebody goes, oh, I don't want to pay taxes. The money doesn't even go to what I believe in, or where is some of the money going, or who gets the contracts? We know that there's so much messiness in politics and how money actually does get distributed at the end of the day, and who's taking benefit from it and who's involved and who isn't. So part of me says, if this could work honestly, if this could work, I do see a lot of benefit to it. And I also have this very skeptical side, not because I don't want it to work and not because I don't think that there is a lot of, honestly, kind of mandatory essence to this. But I know that just the way our government is set up as it is and how corporations get away with so much. And even like I think about the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and even ExxonMobil was saying, oh, well, we'll give this many millions, billions of dollars. And of course, after years and years of them then suing, I think the state of Alaska, then they ended up having to pay out not even a quarter of what they originally said they were. So I just know that there can be so much of that in these types of large scale projects, especially when they're in cahoots with the government and fossil fuel industry. And, but I want to just for a minute go back to, what we were previously discussing with climate change and air pollution having disproportionate impacts on Native nations, people of color, and low income communities. And globally, Indigenous peoples have rebuked market-based mechanisms like carbon trading as this false solution to climate change. So maybe you could speak a little bit to whether or not these communities could be accommodated specifically under rebates. Because as our climate website states, a carbon price alone is regressive. So how can policy protect those who are the most vulnerable?
I think the answer is yes. And it's been very inspiring to see, for instance, the coalition that fought very hard and came close to passing a carbon tax in Washington state. They partnered, as I understand it, quite closely with Native people in Washington and tribal governments. And that model is another one that's quite popular among much of the progressive movement behind carbon pricing, which is to use the revenues not as lump sum, like individual payments, but for compensating communities as a whole that have been and are most hurt by fossil fuel pollution and kind of our status quo power system. And that model comes out of one success in California, where you are with the cap and trade system there that was modified thanks to the advocacy of groups like Green for All to distribute 25% of the revenue under cap and trade to low income and communities of color in areas that are most impacted by, mega freeways or lack of access to transportation and poor housing. And so those funds can be distributed more in the forms of grants or any other mechanism that's not individual but collective within a boundary of identity, I guess. I think that having a combination of those is one way to go about it, because if you only return the money to specific constituencies, people all are going to fall through the cracks, and they might be the people that we most want to help. So you have to have something in there that distributes the revenue on an individual basis, especially because, the California model doesn't necessarily apply in states like my home state, Oregon, where there aren't the same concentrated environmental justice kind of communities, but there's more diffuse poverty and it doesn't always follow along racial lines. And so getting money back to individuals in a really transparent way makes sure that the policy as a whole isn't regressive. And that's the design that we went with in the DC campaign, which I've been leading for the last few years. It's since transformed away from a carbon pricing policy, not because the coalition wanted it to, but because the council member positioned best to lead on environmental issues just really prefers a mandate approach, but that's a story for another time. Anyhow, the policy that we as a coalition formed through this 100% consensus rebated the vast majority of the revenue, 75% back to DC residents on a per capita basis. And then 20% of the funds were used for community green investments. And then the remaining 5 were for tax credits for area businesses and we designed that policy from this kind of moral, values framework, but also iterating through economic modeling to make sure that it would be on net a positive economic boost for the district. And it turned out that we didn't need to give a very big tax credit to locally based businesses because the economic activity generated from people having that extra cash in their pockets and cycling that money through the local economy was going to be a benefit to them, especially to restaurants and local retailers. And so I think that there's a way that there are most certainly ways to design a policy that end up being very progressive and very inclusive and net benefiting to the communities and individuals who are treated the worst right now.
Thank you for that. This whole time, I've also been wondering, how is big oil responding to these policies? I know that Exxon has been talking about a $50 a ton carbon tax, which to me indicates that if this is the number they are suggesting, then it's clearly a number that will cause zero pressure on their business. And in Washington State, Initiative 1631, which would have created a carbon fee of $15 a metric ton, and then used the $2.3 billion generated in a 5-year period on clean energy and green jobs, was ultimately defeated after the oil industry spent $30 million opposing this initiative. So yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's true that a lot of the bigger kind of corporate players that are even talking about any kind of environmental policy would prefer a carbon price over other policies, as would many small businesses who, certainly don't oppose climate action, but just see the benefit of a market-based approach that allows them to transition what they produce over time with this sort of like more graceful glide path off of whatever more polluting product they're producing now, in a way that sometimes a mandate approach is a little bit more stark, a little bit more, today you can do X, tomorrow you can't, and it's a more expensive process to retool. But there's also, I think, especially from fossil fuel companies like Exxon, there's a good amount of greenwashing going on, and people are right to look at that skeptically. I think it's positive for the sake of bringing on, especially, any Republican support that's out there to show that there is a way forward that everybody can get behind. But the price level, as you pointed out, is really important. A lot of companies, including some of the oil majors, have internal or shadow carbon pricing that they've been building into their business model for a long time, that anticipates government action at some point, and it forces them to make investments that would be profitable under, whatever kind of climate policy that might be put into effect. So that's sort of, smart planning on their part. But from the communications perspective, I think what they're in part reacting to is the suite of lawsuits that cities and states have brought against companies like Exxon under the Exxon New campaign that our friends at 350 have done a great job raising awareness around. That, decades ago, oil company scientists knew that climate change was happening, that fossil fuels were the primary driver, and what the consequences would be. And these companies just buried that information and went on the attack against climate policy. The New York Times has a great feature on this, I want to say a month and a half ago, that shows that window in the 70s and 80s when we might have taken the kind of action that would prevent the runaway effects we're seeing now. And it documents how that process happened, where they figured out, oh goodness, like we're going to be held accountable for this. We will do what the tobacco industry did, which is discredit the science, bury what we know, and try to undermine what others are figuring out, to keep ourselves making profit from what we sell instead of transforming. And the other thing, too, to know about the Exxon-backed carbon tax proposal is that the main vehicle is really sound and would really actually drive emissions down, but the kind of poison pill that some people are say, not over my dead body, is that it would protect them from tort liability. It would indemnify these fossil fuel companies from those same lawsuits that are increasingly being brought against them from public governments that are paying for the mess that they made, and saying, look, this can't all fall to our public coffers and taxpayers. You have to pony up because you knew this and you did it anyways, and now you're fighting to prevent laws that would make sure we're free of this fossil fuel dependence. And so with a proposal that taxes carbon at a decent rate, but it does so in exchange for protection from being held accountable in the courts, I think that they're trying to split our movement. And it's up to us to, I think, stand strong, both in support of the carbon price that would bring down emissions at the level that we need, and for the judicial system to work in the way that it must. And the last thing I'll say on that actually is that I think we have to keep in mind that all fossil fuel companies are not made equal, and they don't sell the same product. And so the companies selling natural gas, for instance, know that they will remain in business longer than coal, which has a higher carbon dioxide footprint for the same amount of energy generated. And so you'll have oil and gas companies planning in advance that they'll be able to sell and natural gas and keep fracking and keep building pipelines longer than coal companies, which would be put out of business first at lower rates of a carbon price. And so that's something to keep in mind, that it's not a monolithic kind of community even there.
Yeah, it's really important to be able to break down fossil fuel industry into these different categories, because they all are different and their timelines are different. And I appreciate you saying that, and all the things that you've said, I think, are really something for us all who are listening to sit with for a while. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about from earlier in the conversation was talking about how carbon pricing could also incentivize inventors to introduce low carbon products as a means for producers to maintain profits. Of course, these inventions could also be beneficial because, like you were saying, a lot of the cars and other products we use regarding fossil fuels aren't efficient at all. So in one way, I see there being a benefit to it. In the other way, I'm concerned that this focus on carbon pricing is not directly asking us to reassess our energy consumption. And if we don't assess our consumption, it's quite possible that we will create a, quote, green economy that is still ecologically harmful, because the production of so-called energy like hydropower and wind and solar power, when done at mass scale, can be absolutely detrimental in terms of land degradation, habitat loss, water use, community autonomy, and the manufacturing of hazardous materials like in solar panels. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on this complexity, because, like I said, on one hand, I don't think that we're going to suddenly stop using energy. I think most of us are absolutely addicted to modernity in that way. But then I also see this challenge that green energy is not the solution to stopping modern day slavery or environmental destruction.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think one that many of us miss, and it's the reason why there's still a difference between movements for conservation, for clean energy, for climate justice. Like, there are distinctions. And where I come down is in support, first and foremost, of energy efficiency, of conserving energy. And that's why, having a really strong price on carbon pollution is so compelling to me, because it would basically force us to not waste. And unfortunately, we as a whole need to have our wallets tell us not to waste, because every other cultural cue we're getting is to consume. And so, that said, a really strong policy that would drive the levels of conservation that we need, and therefore not require that we cover every available, remaining square foot of wildland with solar panels, or dig up the rest for cobalt, or build enormous steel, industrial products to get us the clean energy we need. Well, if we're not going to do that, then we really do have to change how much energy we're using overall. So it's not a one-for-one substitution, which, what I said before already, that's not even feasible. So to do that, we have to have the cultural commitment to live differently, because without that, you don't have a movement strong enough to pass the laws that we need. And then those laws, even if they were passed, let's say by fiat, they couldn't be sustained, because the people would elect new politicians to overturn them in a heartbeat. So the cultural change and the political economic change that we need cannot be separated. They're really one and the same. And that's where, as much as solving the climate crisis is not an individualistic project, there is a need and an opportunity for each one of us to contemplate what would our lives look like if we were to use less, and to have, I think, a positive orientation around that, considering that so much of the waste and excess and the pollution from it that's killing us is for a lifestyle and livelihoods that don't make us happy a lot of the time. I think any of us, like myself at least, who live and work in a city, and we're so glad to have time in the country and to have time to hike and turn off our phones and learn what the name of this berry that we're picking is, and have a moment with friends that's unmediated by screens. And it's easy to romanticize the kind of simple life, but I think there's something really enduring in that. And I'm looking at a Wendell Berry book right now. Like, why do his words continue to resonate? Why do we have things like cabin porn, where we just want to flip through, internet pages of little secluded cabins in the middle of the woods? There's something so innate, and that we're so hungry for, to simplify our lives, have less noise, have less stuff, have less chaos that comes from this hyper consumeristic, hyper busy and important, capital B, capital I, lives that we're sold in this country, often because we don't have an alternative. I mean, just look at when there's a power outage, how many of us have some of our favorite childhood memories with our families or with our friends when there wasn't power, and we lit some candles and told each other stories and saw each other differently, and had to, we experienced both the kind of thrill of dependence on nature and some of the fear as well, that we don't really know how to live without the technologies and sort of magical superpowers that we've developed through fossil fuels. There's so much reality there that if we can embrace in an excited vision, instead of buying the fear mongering that the fossil fuel industry very much perpetuates. Some of the ads that they've run very effectively in places like California against cap and trade bills, for instance, has been of little grandmothers shivering in their homes with a threadbare blanket because the nasty environmentalists turned off her heat source. And that's that's evil, right? Like that's saying, we're the ones who don't have a social heart and want to put people out of their homes and out of their comforts, when in fact we know there's ways to live well. In fact, the ways to live best are ones where we're free of this polluting addiction. So that's where that's my response to the debate, I think, between conservation and the kind of clean energy hype.
Thank you for that response. I really appreciated the beauty and the passion which you spoke from, and I think it's really important for us to see the multiple sides that really need to be seen, because it isn't a one-stop shop solution answer. It's complex. We've got ourselves in a real pickle as humanity right now. And I really loved hearing your thought process on that. And another thing that I was wanting to ask you about is, you've previously stated that you base a lot of your work focusing on legislature, because theoretically it should be easier to convince a couple dozen decision makers versus millions of voters. But doesn't this require that we vote in leaders and decision makers who are going to support these measures? And then I think about how environmentalists don't have a great track record when it comes to voting. The Environmental Voter Project found that only 50% of environmentalists voted in 2016, in this 2016 presidential election, compared to 69% among all registered voters. And low turnout poses long-term problems. Not only does it affect the outcome of close elections, but when people don't vote, they are not considered likely voters, which means they don't get called by pollsters. So how much of your work is mobilizing people to get out and vote and recentering conversations around environmental concern?
Those are very important stats to get out there, and I think very shocking. I think many of us wouldn't expect that. But it's true that with something that we take for granted, the earth and the ability to breathe and drink water and get food, we haven't been defending those basic needs and rights because we think that they're just going to be around. And instead, the fossil fuel and other polluting industries have lobbyists in the halls of power every single day. I mean, day in, day out, they're there in droves. And so the basic upkeep of a democracy that represents all of our values, not just corporate, it only begins with voting. I think all of the work that I do is in service of a robust democracy, and often the attention really peaks around election times, but the work between elections is just as important, because then you have voters who are educated and mobilizing their communities and really understanding what it even means to be part of a body politic at the community level. So I'd say all of it is about that project of putting people into positions of power that represent the values of sustainability and of justice that I work for. I think that there are organizations worth investing in and checking out to stay involved over the long term. In this last election cycle, groups like Swing Left and Indivisible, and even the larger, well-established groups, League of Conservation Voters, all the way down, did a pretty good job of mobilizing people. Next Gen America really killed it with getting young people, especially, to turn out and vote. And that's a very high area of overlap with young people, and people of color have very high levels of concern on climate change in a way that other voting constituencies might care, but it's sort of a second, third, maybe 15th tier issue. And so the need to enfranchise young voters and voters of color who have been very systemically blocked from exercising their basic democratic rights. If we look at the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, if we look at the incredibly egregious, corrupt behavior in places like Georgia, closing a whole suite of polling locations, purging hundreds of thousands of voters off the rolls. That's all kind of, not to demonize anyone, but there's a very high overlap on that side of systems of white supremacy, of doing the corporate bidding, and often of, pretty extreme right-wing values that have kind of come up through years of planning that the left has not done to consider how to create structural change that prevents the majority from exercising its will. And we know that the majority of Americans do want environmental protection. And even the majority of Trump voters are polled at quite high levels of concern on climate change and even willingness to pay for action. And that's not what I think we often think of. So we know there's a big disconnect between what's going on for all of us in the electorate and then who makes it to these positions of power. So, if there's a simple takeaway from all of that, I'd say, yes, we need to mobilize our friends and networks to vote, but we also need to all become engaged politically on a regular basis. And the best way to do that is to find an organization that you like, get on their mailing list, make sure that you're keeping up to date with opportunities to take action, whether that's calling lawmakers before important votes, or attending rallies or lobby meetings or community meetings. You can do that no matter where you live. And in fact, the further you are maybe from an urban center, the more power you might have in a system where often, less populated areas hold, for instance, more power in the Senate. And you, as one rural voice, can have a lot more access to your lawmakers than one person in a crowded city. So we really do all need to, I think, more than double down on our civic engagement in all of its forms.
Thank you so much, Camila, for this incredible conversation that was so dense, so much information. I know I'm going to have to listen a few times and really study this topic, and I'm really fascinated by it and very grateful for you. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and good luck to us all.
Thanks for listening to For the Wild podcast. I'm producer and editor Andrew Storrs. The music you heard today was provided by S.K. Kakraba. Our podcast team includes our founder and host, Ayana Young, writer and producer, Francesca Glassbell, communications director, Aaron Wise, music coordinator, Carter Lou McElroy, and our co-managing directors, Melanie Younger and Mara Joy. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts and join our Patreon community to receive weekly bonus material. We'll be back next week with another episode of For the Wild.